In this following video, we're going to kind of go over the basics of the software. Now, because the whole point of this is for photographers to be able to get in here and start having fun without actually having to learn all the useless knowledge that you don't need right now in order to kind of more or less spit out your first CGI rendering, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to only cover the things that we need to know or the things that are important for us to comfortably work with the software to do that first image. So first things first is on the right, we have the create tab, the modify tab, all these goodies that the software offers, whether it's create a particle system, a visual like a visual effects particle simulation type of deal with objects, things like that, cameras, lights, everything that you want kind of lives on the right. So you have your standard objects, your particles, your patch grids, blah, 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 all this stuff. So you can kind of explore, look through it, click through it. None of this is really crazy complex in terms of what it is. It's kind of straightforward. But for now, for what we're going to do, we're kind of going to stick to the plane. And what this is just a ground plane, and this will help us catch shadows and reflections and produce reflections onto the vehicle. So that's the tab. The next one going over is the modify tab. And these are your modifier attributes to the object. So let's say you have a plane. And now what we're going to do is here's your plane. So here's the modify tab. So if you press F4, this is your wireframe over a solid object. So as you can see, we have that. Press G to get rid of the grid. So here we change the segments per the plane. So let's say what we want to do is create a cyc wall, kind of like a studio cyc wall. So we'll bump up some of these segments. And then what we'll do is create a modifier called edit poly. And you could either add it to the stack. So the way you could think about this is like in Photoshop, working with like a smart layer where you're not destructive. And you could always go back, go on top. Now, what I typically like to do is actually collapse it. So once I have my plane, I don't want it. So I have my editable poly. No more plane. So now what I'm going to do is select these edges. I'm just clicking on one, double clicking. Now I hold left shift on the keyboard and I'm just dragging them up, 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 and I'm just clicking and unclicking. As you can see, we're creating that little cyc wall effect. So there we go. So the next thing we'll do is we'll add a modifier called Turbo Smooth, and this kind of smooths it out by subdividing the mesh. So think about this in Photoshop aspects. Let's say you have an image that's 400 pixels by 400 pixels, and you draw a circle. So then you upres the image to, let's say, 2000 pixels, and you're gonna get the jagged edges. So what this does, it's almost like vectorizing the object. So that's what it does, Turbo Smooth. The more you add, the more vectors you get, the more pixels you get per that edge. So as you can see now, we're rounding it. And then this is where it's like up to you how you want to explore this, whether you want to or not. For our video, we're not really going to do any complex modifiers, but this is just kind of what the software offers. So there's things kind of like bend, and what this does, it bends and warps the shape. So for instance, if we want to add a little cove to the cyc wall, we're just going to bend it out like that. As you can see now, it's a rounded cyc wall. And then again, the whole idea of it being a stack, if we go down to editable poly, we're back to this, go up to turbo smooth, and then this little guy turns off, kind of look in the front. And as long as you're doing this in kind of like the whole idea of a non-destructive workflow, so let's say you're gonna extrude that out there, you go up, as you can see, just keeps adding it. So before, after. So that's kind of what this is. And there's a lot of different modifiers. You just kind of, if you want to explore with it, look up tutorials, little documentations and what they are. I'm not really going to focus too much on that simply because we don't really need it for rendering a car. The whole point of these tutorials that we're doing here is if you're new to CGI and you do photography, how can you get into this and just start having fun and producing imagery without having to actually overthink things and learn more than you have to? So that's that. We're going to delete that, that's that. So the next thing in 3D Max, this is actually important, is the layer manager. Typically you don't have it up here the way I have it. So what you want to do is you want to right click and click on layers. And this opens up this little tab. So if you click on this guy, toggle layer explorer, this window comes up. These are your layers. So there's always the default layer, that's standard. And as you can see, our object, our plane, so we'll just name this cyc wall. That's our object. So let's say we have a scene. We'll just create a box, another box. We'll create a teapot. So let's say we want to have our cyc wall and we want to put it on a new layer. Again, this is just like Photoshop layers, but think of this more like creating groups within the layer manager. So we're going to create a new one. We're going to call this background, and that's where our cyc wall is going to live. So now if we want to hide it and unhide it, we could. So again, default layers where everything goes, and the sooner you start working with layers and organizing your assets, the easier life's going to be. Because if you have everything living in default, it's just going to be a pain in the butt to organize things or kind of hide and unhide and isolate things when rendering. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to select these objects and we're going to create a new group called props. Now in 3D Max, they're all called layers, but hypothetically speaking, if you compare it to Photoshop, these are groups because these items live within that group. So, okay, we hid that, we hid that. So now we can isolate it. So for instance, if we're doing a car, and this is what we'll go over in the near future, you're gonna have a thing called wheels, brakes, rotors, because every car has four wheels, or a lot of them do, and that's how we're gonna group it all up. Then we're gonna do like chassis, things like that, so that way we can isolate things quickly and prep the vehicle easily without having to look at the whole thing at the same time. So then the next thing is, if you look down here, there's this little thing. It's the hierarchy tab. This is kind of like layers, but it's what is linked to what. It's kind of like the whole cause and effect, the parent, the child system. So right now, all the items we have created, none of them are linked to anything. So let's say we want this teapot to be the master element. So if you go in the top left, select and link, you click this, we're going to select this box, link it to the teapot, and all we're doing is we're clicking and dragging and linking. And as you can see, our teapot has this little arrow up here, and those items disappeared. These items are now living to the teapot. The teapot is our hero. So whatever we do to the teapot, those items follow. If we rotate it, they follow. So the way I use the hierarchy is, if you have a car, your chassis is your hero. That's the car. Then you have your wheels linked, your tires are linked to the suspension, the rims are linked to the tires, the brake rotors, calipers are linked to the suspension or the rims, whatever you want to do. But that's how you want to think about it. So that way when you do like a wheel turn for static images, turning left, turn right, you only have to rotate one element. And then if you go to the create tab, to this one that says helpers, you could actually create a point. And now these points, they don't render out. They're just kind of like helpers. And in After Effects, they're like null objects where they're there, but they don't really do anything until you link things. So for instance, we're going to put this point up here, and we are actually going to select this teapot and link it to this null object, to this point. And so now when we rotate the point, this rotates, so on. So that's that. That's your general concept of the hierarchy tab. And again, layers, hierarchy, both very useful. So then the next thing, it's another very important window. This is the render window, and the shortcut to this is F10, or it's this little button with the teapot and like the gear looking icon. But I usually just use shortcut, so F10. And this is in general the final image specs. This is what our image size is, our image quality, all those things that you want to adjust that creates the actual final image. That's that. So for instance, right now we have our aspect ratio at 1.5. This is your standard full frame camera. And what we'll do is, right now, as you can see, this doesn't look like the standard crop that we're looking for. So if you hold shift and press F, this turns on the safe frames, they're called. And the other way, if you click on the word perspective and you do show safe frames, that enables it. So now you can see apples to apples of what the final output will be. So if we go to the create tab under the cameras, we're going to create a camera and click on perspective, click on cameras, camera. So now we have our camera, and that's that's the general setup of that. And then if we go to like here, this is, and we'll go through this when we're actually doing the rendering segment of the tutorial. This is where you would set up your light sources for the actual environment, your backplate image, and then turn on lens flare, how the exposure works. This is all within the render tab. And then last but not least, again, there's probably going to be more things I'm going to point out as we go through a tutorial, but it's going to be the material editor. And if you press M, That's the shortcut for the material editor. This here is your materials. This is your car paint, your tire material, your brake rotor, your whatever, emblem, chrome, blah, blah, blah. This is what you will use to give the attributes of how that material is. So if you think about this, when you you go to Hobby Lobby or whatever, you buy a scale model. So it's gray. This is how it is. It comes primered or plastic, whatever it is, it's gray. It doesn't come painted. Material library is your custom paints. So if we apply baby blue to it, now we have that. And so here, well, this one's going to be, so when you start 3D Max, this should stay standard. So what we're going to do is go to general or materials, Corona, and then Corona layered or Corona legacy material. So here we go. Now we're going to change this to red, like so. Now we have a red teapot. And then if you want to give it a reflection, just change the level to 1. As you can see, now our red paint has a reflective property to it. Now, what you can do, and this is what we'll be doing for this segment of tutorials, is kind of using whatever Corona does offer from their material library. So if you don't have the Corona tab showing, and you should when you install it fresh, but if you don't, for whatever reason, if you just right click in a gray area up top, and then this window comes up, you just want to select the Corona Render official toolbar. So this toolbar is going to come up. And by default, this should be up because whenever you install the program, this is the first thing that pops up when you launch 3D Max. So what we're going to do is go to this icon right here, and it's Open Corona Material Library. So this is going to open up. And this is the pre-made Corona Render materials. So whenever you're installing the Corona Render plugin, you want to make sure you install the material library, since I will be using a lot of these throughout this video, just to kind of make it a very easy, very straightforward, very drag and drop type of tutorial. So for instance, you do the car paint, we're just going to drag and drop that into here. As you can see, it automatically created a car paint shader for us. So we'll put that on the teapot. So let's say we're going to do a ceramic or concrete. I'm just going to select this concrete material, pop it in there. We're going to put that on the cyc wall, so on. And then let's do glass. And let's find a cool looking glass material. So glass, thin, clear. Let's do this. We're going to put it on here. And now if we want to make it a red glass, we're just going to drag it up top, name underscore red. And then all you have to do is for refraction, change the color to red. And now we have a red glass. And we're going to drag it on that. So now what we're going to do is go to Corona under the lights, create a simple softbox over top. So the T is a shortcut for top. So I'm just going to go to that viewport, create it. F is front, drag it on top, visible to camera, uncheck that. And then if I click on the front word, same thing like we had perspective. So what I'll do is click on front, extended viewports, and then Corona interactive. And this is your real-time preview. So as you can see, now we have a real-time preview of our items. And then the other thing is, and we'll kind of go over this when we're doing the tutorials, a lot of times you're going to want to use this thing called UVW map, and this gives your item mapping coordinates. So that way your textures or whatever show up properly. So there's that. We'll turbo smooth this so it gets nice and round. So that in a nutshell is your basic introduction to some of the important uh, controls that we'll be using. And again, like I mentioned, I'll probably be showing more as we go through the tutorial and be pointing it out like, hey, this is a new thing that we haven't gone over yet. But in a nutshell, for rendering a car and you're new to 3D and you don't really want to learn about things you don't really need for creating a pretty picture, it's very simple. Your layers for organizing, your material editor for the materials, your general scene, camera, light setup, your pre-made materials that Corona comes with, and your render settings to finalize the final output of the image. Other than that, everything else moving forward is getting more involved and more complex. And we'll go over some of the things like adding UV coordinates to a tire and things like that. But otherwise, that's as simple as it gets. You focus on these three things, and then you more or less let your imagination go wild.